So when it comes to personality typing these days, there are two systems that come to mind. One of them's the Big Five and the other one is MBTI. So one of them is a system that looks at how you score across 5 different parameters, and the other one is a system that provides you with an acronym of 4 letters and gives you 4 different cognitive functions in a certain order to go alongside that. So the Big Five is an entirely behaviourally based model. It's a model that looks at how people are behaving in their population sample and also looks at how people are behaving in general across a much wider population sample. So if you're doing a Big Five test, you take a population sample of about 100 people, let's say, then you notice if they score highly on a certain trait, they tend to exhibit certain behaviours. You then apply that population sample to the entire population when you're using marketing, when you're using political campaigns, and then you find the results are consistent. People consistently behave in ways which reflect their Big Five score. But this doesn't apply to an individual. You see, an individual's Big Five score can change according to their life. That means it's not a personality test per se, it's just a measurement of how you are behaving at a certain moment. So let's say if you're going through a phase of your life over 1 or 2 years, you're exhibiting this certain Big Five score, you are going to be within this group of society. That group always remains static, because while there's an influx, while there are people leaving the group, coming and going, you know how it is, as they change their Big Five score, there is always a fixed amount of people, more or less. And if that group subsides as society progresses, then marketing campaigns will target that group in a different way. So you take a population sample, you generalize it, then you find the behaviors of people across society can be predicted based upon, let's say, whether they are highly conscientious or highly neurotic or highly disagreeable or highly introverted. All of these different traits will correspond to different behaviors, and they will correspond to a target audience for either news campaigns, political campaigns, marketing campaigns, etc. And from taking such population samples, generalizing that information across the entire population of any given society, the Big Five becomes an incredibly effective tool for anything that revolves around predicting the behaviors of other people and creating campaigns and marketing strategies in order to target those portions of people the best. And for this reason, the Big Five is incredibly profitable, because all businesses, all governments are going to be interested in this kind of applicability. But when it comes to MBTI, or more specifically Jungian typology, well, this is only concerned with the cognitive functions. Yes, there might be some behavioural implications of those functions, but that is unreliable, because the thing about cognition is it's adaptable. Not only is cognition adaptable, but it's also fluid. There is no type per se, because everybody exists in their own unique position across a vast cognitive spectrum. The 16 types are just general areas that somebody inhabits. Just because 2 people inhabit the same cognitive area doesn't mean they're thinking in the same way. So if you take a cognitive approach, place people into a box, and then start making predictions based upon this box they reside in, it's not going to work, because their position in the box is always changing. If you do online tests, you might notice there are 2 specific styles. You get a lot of modern tests coming out at the moment which are seeking to accurately determine the actual cognitive stack of a person. I'll link a couple of those tests down below. But I'd say the vast majority of tests that use an MBTI paradigm, whether they come from MBTI or not, employ the Big Five model. They actually do a Big Five test, they'll give you a Big Five score, and they'll use an acronym that suggests cognitive functions that you don't necessarily have. For example, I'll take myself. If I did this version of MBTI test, this Big Five replica, I would get extroverted, intuitive, thinking, judging, and then they have that neuroticism score, and I'd get an A there as well. So does this correspond to my cognitive functions? No, not in any way, shape or form, but it does correspond to my Big Five score. So you see now that this isn't actually a cognitive functions test, this is a Big Five test. This is not a cognition test, this is a behaviour test. And as a behavioural test, it's accurate. It is accurately predicting my behaviour, because my behaviour does correspond to those Big Five parameters. I am, according to those cleverly disguised Big Five parameters, extroverted, intuitive, thinking, judging, assertive. But that isn't my cognitive stack. Those aren't my cognitive functions. My cognitive functions are introverted intuition, introverted thinking, extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing. So why is there a discrepancy here? What is the dissonance and where is it coming from? Well, the dissonance doesn't actually come from the MBTI code. I don't actually have that much of a problem with the MBTI code. I think it's flawed. I think there are better codes. But as far as trying to bridge the gap between cognition and behaviour, I think MBTI have done an absolutely incredible job with the creation of those codes. And in many ways, the INFJ code is suitable for me. It does bridge the gap between my behaviour and cognition. The ENTJ code, however, does not, but it is a representation of my Big 5 score. And now I'm going to break down exactly why that is the case and go step by step through each of the Big 5 parameters and explain how they correspond to the pseudo MBTI acronym. So why do I receive an extroverted result? In cognitive terms, I'm not an extrovert. I can be extroverted, but that doesn't make me, by default, an extrovert. It just means I'm an introvert who can behave extroverted in certain situations. So why do I get an overwhelmingly extroverted result on a Big 5 test or something corresponding to that? The reason is I'm sociable. I'm a sociable introvert. Most of the questions on Big 5 tests and pseudo MBTI tests are going to ask you questions pertaining to how sociable you are in order to ascertain whether or not you are extroverted, because this is a huge portion of what it means to be extroverted or introverted within a Big 5 paradigm. So do I gravitate towards loud noises, towards crowds, towards high energy, fast-paced situations? Can I just take a lot of extroverted information in my stride? No. No to all of those things. I'm an introvert. I cannot handle a lot of stimulation. It doesn't matter what kind of stimulation it is. Even if it's social, I can't handle a lot of it. But if I was asked a question as to whether I'm friendly, whether I make eye contact with people, whether I enjoy the company of people, whether I have a large selection of friends, whether I have different social circles, whether I enjoy different cultures, whether I like to go outside the house, whether I like to get things done, whether I like to partake quite intensely in various kinds of external activities. Yes, absolutely. Am I energetic? Do I come alive in people's presence? Do me and other people have a kind of a bounce whereby we both receive energy from one another? Yes, because I'm a sociable introvert. But a sociable introvert would most commonly receive an extroverted score on a Big 5 parameters. And since both systems use the same words, introvert, extrovert, to describe this particular behavioural phenomenon, I'll now move on to openness. Openness on a Big 5 corresponds directly to the pseudo MBTI's intuition. Openness is a person's predisposition towards new things. It's their openness, it's a lack of natural conservatism. It's their willingness to take in lots of new information. It's their ability to form a big picture view of their internal and indeed external world in order to allow multiple things that may otherwise conflict to coexist. It's a quality that allows us to bring all things into balance and harmony and find the underlying connections between other things. This is the behavioural version of the cognitive phenomenon intuition. So obviously, I'm speaking the way I am. I am an intuitive personality. That also means I score as highly open on the Big 5 score. And conversely, someone with a low openness score will get a sensing score, because a low openness correlates with being more concrete, with being more narrow in scope, more detail-oriented, more interested in inhabiting a small portion of reality with greater intensity than occupying, as a more open person would, a larger portion of reality with relatively less intensity. And as follows, it isn't surprising at all, as an introverted intuitive dominant, I scored about 90% open on a Big 5 test. And now let's move on to agreeable versus disagreeable. And despite the fact that my MBTI code is INFJ, which I personally find very misleading because I don't think INFJs are feeling types per se, I tend to get a disagreeable score on a Big 5, which is the behavioural version of the cognitive phenomena of thinking over feeling. Therefore, I'm disagreeable more than I am agreeable. And thus the behavioural version of thinking is someone who values objective harmony over subjective harmony. Someone who will place logic, or what they perceive to be logical, as having a greater value than the sensitivities of other people. So for as long as you place logic, for as long as you place the truth over the sensitivities of other people, for as long as you were willing to stand up for your logical circuits and effectively bypass your emotional circuits in order to do what you personally think is more logical, is more rational, you will receive a disagreeable score. So on the pseudo MBTI score, I would score to a high degree as a thinker, because I'm someone who likes to communicate his versions of the truth, his own truths, to other people. I like to argue with other people. I find debating to be extremely enjoyable and mutually rewarding. I do value the sensitivities of other people, but I usually place that as a second priority to the truth being heard. And as such, I receive a disagreeable score despite the fact that my cognitive stack inhabits an INFJ paradigm. If you test as agreeable on a big 5, you tend not to be that confrontational. You tend to value either your own internal emotional harmony or the external emotional harmony of the world around you above logic, above truth being heard, above mechanical order. You value social and emotional order above mechanical order. So going back to my results, we have a social introvert and therefore their score is an E on a big 5 score, and the pseudo MBTI which seeks to replicate that. I have an intuitive score which is the equivalent of openness, and I have a thinking score which in this case is simply the equivalent of being disagreeable. I think it should be fairly obvious to anyone watching this that you don't have to be a feeling or thinking type to be disagreeable, so this is one major flaw of the pseudo MBTI test. Because in trying to align thinking with disagreeable and agreeable with feeling, it suddenly becomes highly flawed. It suddenly becomes highly unreliable. Not unreliable for presenting a big 5 score, because all it is just doing exactly that. But in terms of actually bridging the gap between cognition and behaviour, it becomes extremely unreliable because I don't believe feelers and thinkers have a predisposition towards being either. Feelers can stand up for the logical truth, and thinkers can prioritise their own emotional harmony, or indeed the emotional harmony of other people. Valuing logic doesn't mean you're going to be confrontational, and valuing your own emotional harmony might actually be the reason you stand up for logic, such as in an INTJ's case, for example, whereby their entire values are formed upon what they perceive to be logical. And now let's move on to conscientiousness. Within the pseudo MBTI paradigm, judging equals conscientiousness. It doesn't equal a cognitive function, it has nothing to do with cognitive functions, but it has everything to do with how conscientious you are. What is conscientiousness? Conscientiousness is such things as discipline, work ethic, and the ability to enact change in your world, and your belief in your ability to do so. If you're a completionist, if you perform tasks to a high level, if you tend to achieve your goals without being distracted or procrastinating too much, then you'll tend to receive a high conscientiousness score. And the fact is there's plenty of, let's say, extroverted intuitive dominance, extrovert sensing dominance, who, would have a P within a standard MBTI paradigm, which would actually receive a J in this case, because many of these types are highly conscientious. Many of these types achieve their goals in the real world, while many judges, such as INFJs and INTJs, would actually receive a low conscientiousness score, because they're interested in their own internal rabbit hole of introverted intuition, and maybe less interested than an extroverted lens dominant in enacting change in the real world. Obviously this will vary between all types, but there are versions of the INFJs and INTJs who will score low on conscientiousness, and vice versa. There are versions of ENFPs and ENTPs, ESTPs, ESFPs who will score very high on conscientiousness. Using myself as an example, about 6 or 7 years ago, I would have scored fairly mid-range, maybe even low, on conscientiousness. I was more interested in philosophizing, I was more interested in creating my own internal structures. I went through a lot of my life not being particularly conscientious because that was something I learned. I gradually became more interested in enacting change within the real world because I grew to realize over time that the abstract world is not enough. So now I will receive a J or conscientious within a pseudo MBTI result, but that wouldn't have always been the case. And as such, again, this is an inaccurate means of trying to bridge the gap between a cognitive-based model and a behavioural-based model such as the Big Five. So hopefully by now I would have explained to you why I receive an ENTJ result when I do a pseudo MBTI test, as opposed to why I receive an INFJ result when I do either a real MBTI test or indeed through CPT methodology. But before I leave you, I will touch on neuroticism, because while this isn't a part of the original Jungian typological stack, and while it isn't employed by such systems as CPT, because I don't believe it's relevant to actual cognitive type, it is an effective parameter within a behavioural-based model. So while I could make a completely separate video to the topic of neuroticism because it's so complicated, I will, for the purpose of this video, simplify it to simply mean emotional instability. Emotional turbulence, if you like. This is something which will fluctuate completely, and this is why this addition to the pseudo MBTI score is actually quite effective, because it doesn't change the underlying cognition. It's still compatible with an MBTI paradigm without actually needing to change the relation of the acronym to functions in relation to judging, conscientiousness, thinking, feeling, agreeable, disagreeable. So if you score highly on neuroticism, you'll live in a very emotionally unstable world. Your emotions will have massive peaks, massive troughs, and generally your entire emotional state will be undulating quite wildly. Whereas an assertive person, even if they are emotionally intense, such as myself, will exist in a relatively calm state. They would have found strategies to ensure that their emotions remain within control. A neurotic person is more likely to have a host of other kind of complexes, certain cognitive biases, maybe even leaning more towards heuristics, while an assertive person is more likely to be a well-rounded person. While neuroticism can be a good thing, because it can lead to incredible artistic ingenuity, the complexes that neuroticism can lead to can actually give someone so much of a chip on the shoulder as to create this incredible work ethic that pushes them beyond their limits. So neuroticism doesn't automatically correlate with a life not worth living, but it is still an unhealthy state. It is still a state of relatively higher durations of chronic stress, which is terrible for your longevity, terrible for your immune system, and terrible for your happiness. And as such, if you score highly on neuroticism, even though this has absolutely nothing to do with cognitive functions, and there's probably not that much relation between the cognitive functions and neuroticisms either, I would highly recommend you take measures to get your emotional environment and your sense of identity and inner harmony under control. I might make a separate video on this entirely, but I'd recommend such things as meditating, regular exercise, nutrition, plenty of social time, plenty of sunlight when possible. These are all very basic human requirements, but they're also very easy to lose track of when you're trying to keep up with the mayhem of the modern everyday lifestyle. So hopefully now I should have cleared up the differences between a core MBTI and a pseudo MBTI test. The core MBTI test is the assignment of a 4-letter acronym according to the cognitive stack you inhabit, whereas in the case of the pseudo MBTI test, this gives you a code based upon your Big 5 score. And I cannot emphasize enough that these two concepts are mutually exclusive. You can have one cognitive type and be a completely different Big 5 code, and as such, with the two different versions of MBTI, you can actually get two completely different codes. And this is also why so many types who aren't actually INFJs think they're INFJs, because they read a description of the Big 5 version of INFJ rather than the core MBTI version. And while there are many reasons for mistyping, this is a huge contributing factor. So thank you so much for watching. As usual, I'd absolutely love to hear from you in the comments. If you feel you need any additional clarification on the various different dichotomies I've explored in this video, do leave a comment or get in touch with the email on the channel. Make sure to leave a like on the video to help the channel grow, develop and reach new audiences, and if you haven't already done so, make sure to hit that subscribe button with the bell icon next to it to stay notified of future content. I upload a video every single week, so I'll be back same place, same time next week. Take care.